The old clock on the wall struck 10 at night as Richard closed the book he had been reading for hours without really paying attention. The mansion, large and majestic, was enveloped in silence, except for the distant echo of the wind stirring the branches of the trees in the garden. A soft breeze slipped through the slightly open windows, caressing the silk curtains and creating dancing shadows on the walls. The rooms, adorned with fine furniture and exclusive works of art, remained empty as usual. Everything around him radiated wealth, yet a sense of emptiness enveloped him, a loneliness that became more palpable with each passing day. Richard Mansfield, at 78 years old, was the owner of a fortune most could only dream of. He had built an empire from scratch, working tirelessly for decades to consolidate his power and wealth. Over time, his name had become synonymous with success, and the most exclusive doors in the world were open to him. However, success came with a price, one he hadn't recognized until it was too late: the emotional distance between him and his family. Years ago, Richard had lost his wife, Margaret, in a sudden accident. Since then, the house had changed. Where there had once been laughter and family conversations, there was now only the echo of his footsteps. His sons, Edward and Samuel, along with their respective families, visited him occasionally, but their meetings lacked the warmth they once had. In every conversation, money was always mentioned. Projects needing funding, loans to cover expenses, or investments that couldn't fail. Never did they speak about how Richard was feeling, his well-being, or his daily life. The love he had once shared with his wife seemed to have vanished along with her. Maybe I'm exaggerating, Richard often thought, looking for excuses to justify his son's behavior. However, a growing suspicion haunted him: did his family only see him as a source of money? One particular night, when he got up from his chair to fetch something from the kitchen, he overheard something that left him frozen. He was walking down the hallway when, unintentionally, he found himself near the slightly open door of the lounge. Inside were Edward and Samuel, sitting on the brown leather armchairs, with a half-finished bottle of whiskey on the table. "It's just a matter of time," said Edward, in a nonchalant tone. "The old man isn't going to live forever, and when he's gone, everything will be ours. This whole damn place, the accounts, the properties. All we have to do is wait." "Yeah, but we need to make sure the will isn't in the name of some charity or something ridiculous," Samuel replied, laughing. "With how erratic he's been lately, I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to pull something crazy like that." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. His own blood spoke of him as if he were already dead. The pain was deep, but the worst part wasn't hearing those words, it was that he wasn't surprised. For a long time, he had sensed something was wrong, but now he had the confirmation he had so feared. He was nothing more than a shadow, whose worth, in his son's eyes, was reduced to the size of his bank account. He withdrew quietly, avoiding being seen, and made his way to his study, a room filled with memories of a life long gone, photos of his youth, trophies from his days as a businessman, and the books he used to read with Margaret. He collapsed into the leather armchair, his gaze lost on the framed photos that adorned the walls. What had he done wrong? He reflected on how he had raised his sons. He remembered the sacrifices, the endless nights of work to give them everything he had lacked in his own youth. But had those sacrifices distanced him from what truly mattered? Tears filled Richard's eyes, something rare for him. Throughout his life, he had prided himself on his strength, on his ability to make tough decisions without flinching. But this silent betrayal, this coldness, had struck him to his core. What good was all this money if he couldn't even count on the genuine affection of his family? In the days that followed, Richard barely ate or spoke to anyone. He kept his usual routine to avoid suspicion, but in his mind, an idea began to take shape. If his family really only valued him for his money, what would happen if he no longer existed? Not literally, of course, but what if he disappeared from their lives for a while? He needed to know if anyone would seek him out for who he was, not for what he had. One afternoon, while strolling through the garden, he noticed some street workers repairing a broken pipe. They wore simple, dirt-stained clothes, chatting among themselves as if the hard work was merely an excuse to pass the time together. Richard watched them curiously, and a crazy, almost childish idea crossed his mind. What if he lived like them? What if he left behind his wealth and lived among those who had nothing? At first, he dismissed the idea as absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. He needed to disappear. He needed to experience life without luxuries, without comforts. And most importantly, he needed to see what would happen with his family when he was no longer there to finance their lives. The plan began to take shape. With his fortune and connections, Richard could arrange everything without anyone suspecting. First, he would transfer large sums of money to secure accounts, inaccessible to his family. Then, he would sell off some minor properties without raising suspicion, and finally, he would leave the mansion without informing anyone. He would become a wanderer, at least for a while. But not just any wanderer. He would be a man on a mission, to discover the truth about the people around him. Days later, Richard made his first moves. He called his trusted lawyer, David Monroe, a loyal man who had worked with him for decades. In a discreet conversation, he explained his plan. "I want to disappear for a while," Richard told him as they both sipped coffee on the mansion's terrace. David looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Disappear? Richard, what do you mean? The company, your investments. You can't just—" "I know, David," Richard interrupted him calmly. "That's why I need everything to be perfectly covered. I won't be far, just out of sight. I want to see how my family and some associates react if they think I'm no longer around." David leaned back in his chair, pondering. He knew Richard well enough to know that once he had an idea in mind, it was hard to dissuade him. "All right," he finally said. "I'll make the necessary arrangements. But I have to tell you, this is a big risk." "I know," Richard replied, gazing into the distance, toward the horizon. "But it's a risk I'm willing to take." That very night, Richard began packing the few things he would need for his new life. Old, worn-out clothes, some cash, and a few personal items. The mansion, his empire, everything would be left behind for a while. Determined, he walked to the front door, turned one last time to look at the house where he had spent so many years, and with a sigh, stepped out. In that moment, Richard Mansfield ceased to be the wealthy man everyone knew. Now, he was simply another man among millions, searching for a truth that money could not buy. Richard ventured into the city that night, wrapped in the shadows of a reality he had never known. The streets, lit by the flickering lights of the lampposts, seemed cold and unfamiliar. As he walked toward an uncertain destination, he felt the grip of uncertainty tighten around him. Was he making a mistake? Should he have confronted his family directly instead of disappearing like this? But something inside him told him no. His instinct urged him to step away, to observe from afar, and discover the truth without the influence of money. The first hours as a wanderer were not easy. Richard, a man accustomed to comfort, had underestimated what it meant to be invisible to the world. No one looked at him, no one paid him any attention. As he walked among the crowds, his old and shabby suit made him just another shadow in a city that didn't stop for anyone. It hit him when he realized how quickly he had disappeared from everyone's view. No one recognized him, not even the local merchants he had frequented for years. His previous life was vanishing faster than he had anticipated. That first night, he found himself in a public park, a place frequented by those without a home. The benches were occupied by others like him, but he didn't yet dare to approach them. He sat in a corner, watching as the city slowly dimmed. He couldn't help but recall how, from his mansion, he had always looked down on these places, thinking of them as shelters for the less fortunate. But now, he was one of them. The night's cold crept through his worn-out coat. Richard, who had never felt the harshness of sleeping outdoors, soon realized how difficult it would be to adjust to this new life. The ground was hard, and the wind made him shiver. His stomach growled from lack of food, something he had never experienced before. The sensation of hunger, a brutal reminder of what it meant to have nothing. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps made him look up. A man approached, staggering, with a bottle of liquor in his hand. Richard tensed, but the man didn't seem threatening. He slumped onto the bench in front of him, letting out a heavy sigh. He looked like a lost soul, someone who had seen too much of life. "First time on the streets?" the man asked without looking at him, as if he had read Richard's thoughts. Richard, surprised, hesitated before responding. "Something like that," he murmured. The man let out a bitter laugh. "Don't worry. We all end up here one way or another. No one plans to be here, but things happen." This first interaction with a stranger made him feel the harsh reality of the streets. How long could he endure this life without returning to his old comfort? The next day, Richard woke up with aching bones and a new sense of vulnerability. The sun had barely risen, and already he could feel the harshness of what it meant to live without a roof, food, or the security of a home. In the following days, he wandered the streets in search of food and shelter, quickly learning the places where the homeless gathered. It was during these walks that he met Jorge. Richard noticed him immediately, a middle-aged man with skin weathered by the sun and a hard life. Jorge often sat on the same bench in the park, sharing his food and time with others. He always had a smile for those around him, something that puzzled Richard. How could someone with nothing be so at peace with himself? This question led Richard to approach Jorge. "You seem new around here," Jorge said one afternoon, offering him a piece of bread. "I haven't seen you before." Richard, feeling exposed, hesitated before accepting the bread. It was the first time someone had treated him with kindness since he had left his old life behind. "It's complicated," Richard replied, trying not to reveal too much. "We all have our complications," Jorge answered with a knowing smile. "But things get simpler when all you have is your own skin and what you're wearing." Jorge's philosophy surprised Richard. How could someone in such a situation accept his fate with such serenity? This interaction sparked a curiosity in Richard about the lives of the other homeless people, individuals who, like him, had been marginalized by society. Nights on the streets were long and silent, giving Richard plenty of time to think. He couldn't help but let his mind drift back to his previous life, to memories of his youth and his family. Memories of his childhood flooded his mind. He remembered how he had grown up in a humble family, where every penny counted, and how he had sworn never to live in poverty again. But there was something more in those memories, the genuine love of his parents. He remembered how his mother used to sit with him at night, telling him stories and making sure that, even though they didn't have much, he always felt their love. That love, that human warmth, was what was missing in his current life. Another memory overtook him, the day he met Margaret, his late wife. She had loved him for who he was, not for what he had. Margaret had always reminded him that money wasn't everything, but he, blinded by ambition, had ignored those words. Now, sitting in a dark corner of the city, those words took on a whole new meaning. Guilt consumed him. Richard wondered if, in his obsession with success and money, he had distanced himself not only from his family but from himself. Had he lost sight of what truly mattered in life? This deep internal conflict was what drove him to continue with his experiment, seeking answers that his old life could not provide. As the days passed, Richard began to notice something strange. On more than one occasion, when he was standing in line for food or simply resting in the park, he had the feeling that someone was watching him. At first, he thought it was paranoia brought on by the tension of his new life, but soon he realized there was something more. One afternoon, while waiting in line at a community kitchen, a man Richard had never seen before approached him. He was just another vagabond, with dirty clothes and disheveled hair, but something about his eyes was different. "You're not like the others, are you?" the man said, his voice soft but firm. Richard looked at him, puzzled. How could this man know? "Excuse me," Richard replied, feigning ignorance. "You don't belong here," the man continued, locking eyes with Richard. "I can see it in you. I don't know why you're here, but be careful. The streets aren't what they seem." Before Richard could respond, the man disappeared into the crowd. This encounter left Richard feeling deeply unsettled. Who was that man, and how could he know something about him? From that moment on, Richard began paying more attention to his surroundings, searching for signs that maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Despite moments of fear and uncertainty, something started to change in Richard. With each passing day, he felt the barriers he had built over his life slowly crumble. The connections he was forming with the other vagabonds, though superficial at first, began to have a profound impact on him. He felt a kind of freedom in not having to maintain a facade. There were no expectations, no money to manage, no major decisions to make. There was only the present, with all its challenges. Jorge became his closest friend on the streets. They shared stories at night, and Jorge taught him how to survive in such a hostile environment. One night, as they both gazed at the stars from a corner of the park, Jorge said something that struck Richard deeply. "The problem with money," Jorge began, looking up at the sky, "is that it makes you think you control everything. But in reality, it just controls you. It gives you a false sense of security, but when everything falls apart, you realize how little you truly have." Richard didn't reply, but those words echoed in his mind. He was beginning to understand that, throughout his life, he had been chasing something that couldn't truly fill him. Money hadn't been the answer to his problems, it had been a barrier, keeping him away from what really mattered, genuine human relationships. The days on the streets had settled into a strange but steady routine for Richard. He no longer felt like a tourist in a foreign world. He was beginning to understand the invisible dynamics that kept those on society's margins afloat. Though he still carried many secrets, his ragged appearance and worn clothes made him blend in. He was no longer Richard Mansfield, the magnate. He was just another man among the city's shadows, trying to survive. As time passed, Richard felt a growing need to know what had become of his family since his disappearance. There was no way anyone could have found out about his plan, so his sons must have been utterly confused. At least, he hoped so. Part of him wished that, at the very least, his family was desperately searching for him. That illusion accompanied him, but it also filled him with dread. What if his suspicions were correct? What if no one missed him at all? The time had come to find out. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, Richard made his decision. He walked toward the neighborhood where he had lived for so many years, but this time with a knot in his stomach. The large houses, with their well-manicured gardens and luxury cars parked outside, now seemed strangely distant. Once, this place had provided him with a sense of security and success, but now he only saw the superficiality. The facades of the houses, which once symbolized status and power, now seemed hollow and soulless. From a distance, he watched his own mansion. It was as majestic as he remembered, but something had changed. Richard couldn't help but notice an air of uncomfortable calm. There was no sign of distress. Was his family not worried about his absence? No search teams, no police cars, no reporters looking for answers. He hid behind some nearby bushes and waited. Part of him expected to hear his sons' voices or see his niece Alice come out the front door with some kind of concern on her face. But what he saw instead left him cold. Edward, his eldest son, stepped out of the house, talking on the phone, but he didn't seem anxious. He was laughing. Richard moved closer, trying to catch some of the conversation. Yes, I know. Everything's the same. The will is in order, so there's no rush, Edward was saying in a casual tone, as if his father's disappearance was just a minor inconvenience. Samuel and I have been handling everything. Once it's official, you know what comes next. Richard felt as though he had been punched in the stomach. His son's cold words tore him apart inside. There was no concern, no love. only calculation and pragmatism. He decided that was enough for the day. The pain was too strong to confront directly, so he retreated back to the streets where he now belonged, but this time with a heavier heart. A few more days passed before Richard decided to return. He had one last hope, Alice, his favorite niece. She had been like a daughter to him. Since childhood, Alice had been different from the rest of the family. While Edward and Samuel had always shown a tendency toward materialism, Alice seemed to have a more open, sincere heart. Perhaps she was the one who truly missed him. Finally, the day came. Richard was sitting on a busy street corner where vagabonds often begged for change. He had his head down when he saw Alice coming out of a nearby cafe. His heart skipped a beat. She was right there, just a few feet away, and she looked as elegant as always, though never ostentatious. He could feel the urgency inside him, the desire to approach her, to embrace her, to reveal his true identity. But something held him back. He knew it wasn't the right time. He needed to know what she was thinking before revealing himself. Alice walked by, distracted, lost in her own thoughts. Richard stood up slowly and extended his hand toward her, as any beggar would when asking for spare change. "Could you help me with some change?" he murmured, keeping his voice low. Alice glanced at him briefly, barely acknowledging him, and pulled a bill from her wallet without stopping, without even looking him directly in the eye. "Here you go," she said absent-mindedly before continuing on her way. Richard stood frozen in place, the bill in his hand. Alice hadn't recognized him. To her, he was just another beggar on the street. That simple gesture, so superficial and automatic, broke his heart. She had helped him, but without showing any real empathy, any emotional connection. It was a painful reflection of what his family life had become, empty gestures, acts without soul. As Alice disappeared into the crowd, Richard sat back down, unable to move. Reality hit him harder than ever before. Even the person he had loved the most in his family now saw him as a stranger, a blurry figure in the background of her life. The days following his encounter with Alice were difficult for Richard. The emptiness inside him grew, and the pain of silent betrayal deepened with every thought. He realized something disturbing. He had vanished from his previous life, and yet no one seemed to really notice. During the nights, as he shared his makeshift shelter with other vagabonds, Richard couldn't help but reflect on his situation. Jorge, his street friend, had been his greatest support, but even with his kindness, Richard felt an emotional chasm. He had discovered more honesty and compassion on the streets than within the walls of his own home. Yet, that didn't fill the void left by his family. One afternoon, while walking through the park where he often met Jorge, Richard saw something that left him disoriented. There, on a nearby bench, were his sons, Edward and Samuel, sitting with a lawyer. Curiosity drove him to approach cautiously, staying far enough away not to be recognized. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a serious expression, held a thick envelope in his hands. "Your father's will is quite clear," the lawyer was saying. "There isn't much you can do if he doesn't reappear. The fortune is in a trust, but if he's officially declared dead in a few months, you'll have access to everything." Richard's stomach churned. His sons were planning to declare him dead to get their hands on his money. There was no longer any doubt. It wasn't just that they didn't miss him, they were actively waiting for his final disappearance so they could profit from it. The conversation continued, but Richard could no longer hear it. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. In his heart, he had always kept a small hope that all of this was just a nightmare, a misunderstanding that could be corrected at some point. But no. The truth was harder and more painful than he had ever imagined. That same night, Richard gathered with Jorge and some other homeless men at their makeshift shelter. The fire crackled softly as they shared their meager food. Richard was quiet, lost in his thoughts. He knew he had to make a decision. He could no longer live in this limbo, either physically or emotionally. Jorge watched him closely, and after a while, he approached. "You seem more down than usual, my friend," he said, offering him a piece of bread. "What's going on in your head?" Richard sighed, staring into the flames. There was something about the simplicity of that scene that comforted him, but it also forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. "I've seen things that have made me doubt everything," Richard replied hoarsely. "My family, myself. I don't know if I can ever be the same." Jorge looked at him with a knowing gaze, as if he fully understood what Richard was going through. "The streets have a way of showing us things we'd rather not know," Jorge said. "But sometimes, those revelations are necessary for us to move forward." "What are you going to do?" Richard remained silent for a moment. The question hung in the air, and he knew he would soon have to face the answer. He couldn't keep living in the shadows, but he also couldn't just return to his old life and pretend nothing had changed. Finally, Richard looked up and met Jorge's eyes. "I have to close this chapter," he said, with determination in his voice. "It's time to face the truth and make a final decision." He knew what he had to do. He knew he would soon have to confront his family and the reality he had uncovered. It wouldn't be easy, but he could no longer keep running. The time had come to face the betrayal, to take control of his life once more, and to decide the future of his fortune and his legacy. Richard's emotional journey had reached a critical point. He had seen the coldness of his family, the indifference of those he had trusted most. But he had also learned valuable lessons from the people he had shared the streets with. The moment of the final confrontation was near. The city's sky dawned covered by a dense layer of gray clouds, as if the weather itself sensed the gravity of what was about to happen in Richard Mansfield's life and his family's. After weeks of silence, weeks of living on the streets as an invisible man, the day had come that would mark the end of his experiment. The day everything would change. That morning, before leaving the small shelter where he had slept, Richard allowed himself a few moments of reflection. The time he had spent on the streets had transformed him more deeply than he could have ever imagined. At first, his goal was simple: to find out if his family truly loved him or only saw him as an endless source of money. But what he had uncovered in the process had been far more complex and devastating. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe. Despite everything he had accomplished in life, despite the fortune he had accumulated, Richard realized that his wealth had never made him truly happy. It had distanced him from what mattered most: genuine human connections. On the streets, he had witnessed kindness from the most unexpected places, from people who, despite having almost nothing, were willing to share everything. And that experience had shaken his soul. Because while strangers offered him comfort and companionship without expecting anything in return, his own family had betrayed him with their silent greed. Richard's thoughts turned to Edward and Samuel, his two sons, the same ones he had seen conspiring to divide his inheritance in his absence. They had shown a coldness that had broken his heart. And Alice, his niece, who had once been like a daughter to him, had also fallen short of his hopes. The image of Alice handing him a coin on the street, without even recognizing him, was still etched in his mind. Now, he was ready. He had to face his family, reveal what he had done, and force them to accept the consequences of their own actions. But he also needed to free himself. For too long, the weight of his fortune had been a burden, a responsibility that had emotionally chained him. Today, he would break those chains. Richard walked through the city streets in silence, keeping a slow but steady pace. Each step brought him closer to his destination, the mansion he had once called home. That mansion, which now felt like a symbol of everything he had lost, loomed in the distance like a shadow over his life. He knew that what he was about to do would change the course of his family forever. As he walked, his mind filled with images of his previous life. He clearly remembered the moments when he had made difficult decisions to protect and provide for his family. From the moment he started building his business empire, he had always believed he was doing it for the good of his loved ones. But now, looking back, he realized that somewhere along the way, he had lost balance. He had allowed money and power to become the center of everything, and in the process, he had disconnected from the people who mattered most. He had witnessed what excessive wealth could do to a family. He had seen it in his own sons, in the way they spoke of him, not as their father, but as a source of income. Greed had corroded everything. Now, Richard felt at peace with his decision to walk away from that world. He had decided to donate the majority of his fortune to charities, to causes that could truly make a difference in the lives of others. He knew this would bring conflict with his family, but he was prepared to face it. When he finally arrived at the mansion, a shiver ran down his spine. It was a place that had once been synonymous with success and security but now only evoked sadness and betrayal. Richard stood in front of the massive iron gates that led to the property, and for a moment, he hesitated. Was he truly ready for what was to come? Yes, he was. There was no turning back. The gates opened slowly as Richard approached. There was no fanfare, no one waiting to welcome him with open arms. He entered the house in the same worn-out clothes he had been wearing for weeks, his shoes dusty, and his hair disheveled, nothing like the Richard his sons remembered. The transformation was obvious, and he knew that his physical appearance would be the first thing to shock his family. The mansion's grand foyer, with its enormous crystal chandelier and polished marble floors, seemed disproportionately opulent compared to the man now walking across it. Richard no longer belonged to that world of luxury. He felt that he had ceased to be part of that environment the moment he had taken the first step away from his home weeks ago. But today, his return was not to reintegrate into that life, but to leave it behind for good. From the foyer, he could hear murmurs coming from the great hall. He knew they were all there, Edward, Samuel, Alice, and some other distant relatives who, like vultures, had begun circling the mansion, waiting to pick over what they believed would be a vast inheritance. David Monroe, his lawyer, was also there, ready to ensure that everything was handled according to Richard's wishes. When Richard entered the room, the murmuring ceased immediately. All eyes turned to him, and silence fell over the room like a stone slab. No one could believe what they were seeing. The man standing before them looked nothing like the Richard Mansfield they knew. Edward was the first to break the silence. "Father, what happened to you?" His voice, normally confident and strong, now trembled slightly. Samuel, on the other hand, was quick to show his displeasure. "Where have you been?" he spat, crossing his arms over his chest. "We all thought you were dead, and now you show up like this, after weeks. What the hell is going on here?" Richard looked at them both with an almost inhuman calm. He had known this moment would come and had anticipated it for a long time. But even with all the mental preparation he had done, nothing could have prepared him for the torrent of emotions that hit him in that instant. He looked at his sons, and for a moment, he saw only the children he used to hold by the hand, the ones he had promised to protect and care for. But those children had grown, and somewhere along the way, they had become strangers. "I left," Richard finally broke the silence, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "I left to see what would happen when I was no longer here. I wanted to know what you would do, how you would react. I wanted to discover the truth." Richard's words were like a slap to everyone in the room. No one knew what to say. Uncomfortable murmurs began to fill the space as some of the distant relatives exchanged bewildered glances. What was really happening? Edward was the first to recover from the shock. His face, which had initially shown surprise, was now starting to fill with anger. He wasn't used to feeling out of control, and the situation was overwhelming him. "You left to spy on us?" he spat, taking a step toward his father. "Is that what you're saying? You wanted to test us or something? This is ridiculous. We've been worried about you, we've called the authorities, we've done everything we could to find you, and now it turns out this was all some experiment of yours." Richard kept his gaze fixed on Edward, without blinking. He knew his son was lying, but there was no point in arguing with him. Actions spoke louder than words, and Richard had witnessed his son's true intentions in his absence. "It wasn't an experiment, Edward," he said firmly. It was the only way I could discover the truth. And now I know what you really think of me. I've heard everything." Samuel, who had remained silent until then, let out a nervous laugh, as if trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation. "Come on, father," he said, crossing his arms. "This doesn't make any sense. If you wanted to find something out, why didn't you just talk to us? This whole thing is strange, and it makes no sense." Richard looked at him with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything," he replied. "What I've seen, what I've heard, can't be undone. For weeks, I've watched you talk about my fortune, about what you would do with my properties when I was gone. Neither you nor Edward showed the slightest genuine concern for my well-being." The weight of those words fell over the room like a sentence. The atmosphere grew heavier, and the faces of those present began to reflect the discomfort of the situation. Alice, who had remained silent until that moment, stepped forward. Her face was pale, and her eyes were a mix of guilt and confusion. "Uncle," she began, her voice trembling. I didn't know you were out there. I never imagined that." The words got stuck in her throat, and tears began to well up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Richard looked at her with a tenderness that contrasted with the hardness he had shown toward his sons. Alice, more than anyone, had once been the only person in the family who had shown a genuine interest in him as a person. But even she had let him down. "Alice," he said softly, moving closer to her. "I love you, and I always will. But even you, at some point, stopped seeing who I was. We lost ourselves in the money and the expectations, and what hurts me the most is that I couldn't save you from that." Alice couldn't hold back her tears any longer, and she threw herself into her uncle's arms, hugging him tightly. Richard felt the weight of her regret, but he also understood that, although Alice was sorry, she had been part of the problem too. They all had. Richard gently pulled away from Alice and walked toward the table where he had left the envelope containing the documents that would seal the fate of his fortune. The tension in the room grew even more palpable. Everyone knew that what he was about to do would change their lives forever. He took the envelope in his hands and held it in front of him. "This is my will," he announced, his voice echoing through the room. "I've made some significant changes, and it's time you all knew." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear what was coming next. "During my time away, I had a lot of time to reflect on what I want to leave behind in this world. My legacy, my fortune, everything I've built. And I came to the conclusion that I can't allow all of this to become a burden for you. The money you've been waiting for is not the answer to your problems, and I refuse to let it fall into the hands of people who don't understand its true value." The murmurs began immediately. The distant relatives exchanged uneasy glances, while Edward and Samuel frowned in obvious frustration. Richard, however, remained calm, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. "I have decided to donate the majority of my fortune to charity," he continued, raising the envelope in the air. "The organizations that need it most will receive the resources that can make a difference in the lives of thousands of people. What you've been waiting for, what you believed was yours, will no longer be available to you." The impact of his words was immediate. Edward jumped from his seat, his face red with rage. "You can't do that," he shouted, approaching his father quickly. "It's ours. It's our inheritance. You owe it to us. We've worked for you, we've been here for you. It's ours by right." Richard looked at him with a mixture of sadness and pity. "I don't owe you anything," he replied in a quiet but firm voice. "Everything I did out of love for you, but that love has been lost in greed and selfishness. And now, I must correct that mistake." Samuel, who had been watching with a red face, finally stepped in, unable to contain his frustration. "This is madness," he said with a bitter laugh. "You're stripping us of everything. Our entire lives have revolved around this inheritance, around what you would leave for us. And now you're telling us you're going to give it all away?" Richard looked at him, more resigned than angry. "I'm not giving anything away," he replied calmly. "I'm doing what's right. My legacy won't be remembered by how much money I left you, but by what I did to help those who truly needed it. You never understood what money could do when used with purpose. And that's why I can't allow it to continue feeding this culture of greed." Silence fell over the room once more as Richard placed the envelope containing the revised will on the table. The expressions of disbelief, anger, and despair were evident on Edward and Samuel's faces, but also on the other relatives who, until that moment, had remained quiet. Alice, for her part, seemed to be slowly falling apart. She had understood the weight of her uncle's words, and she knew there was no turning back. The family that had once been a unit had now been irreparably broken, and all that remained were the consequences of the decisions they had all made. Richard looked at his family one last time, feeling the weight of his own emotions. He knew that what he had done was necessary, but that didn't make it any less painful. He had lost his sons long before his disappearance, but now, at least, he had a chance to redeem his legacy. The money he had accumulated throughout his life would serve a purpose greater than his own family. "I'm done here," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing more to say." With those words, Richard turned and began walking toward the door, leaving his family to drown in the emotional chaos he had unleashed. He knew there would be consequences, that his sons would never forgive him, but he was willing to bear that guilt if it meant that his fortune would be used for something more noble. The days that followed the confrontation were hard for the Mansfield family. Edward and Samuel, who had spent years relying on their father's fortune to solve all their problems, found themselves facing a completely different reality. There would be no inheritance, no millions waiting to be divided. Now, they would have to learn to live without the safety net they had been expecting for so long. Alice, though emotionally devastated, found a glimmer of hope. Unlike her cousins, she had not built her life around her uncle's inheritance. Despite her mistakes, she had learned something invaluable from Richard: true value wasn't in money, but in what you did with it. She decided to follow in her uncle's footsteps and began working for one of the charities that had received part of Richard's fortune. There, she found something she had never experienced before: a real sense of purpose. For Richard, the decision he had made brought him a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He had lost his family, but he had gained something much more important: the opportunity to leave behind a true legacy, not one of material wealth, but one of generosity and service to others. He knew his family would never fully understand, but that no longer mattered to him. He had done what was right, and that was enough for him. As time passed, the impact of Richard's decision began to be felt across the country. The organizations that received his donations were able to implement projects that changed the lives of thousands of people. The media spoke of the unexpected generosity of the millionaire who had disappeared and returned to donate his fortune. Richard Mansfield's story became a symbol of redemption, of how a wealthy man had found his true wealth at the end of his life, not in what he possessed, but in what he decided to give away. Richard, for his part, continued living a quiet life, far removed from the luxuries that had once defined his existence. He found peace in simplicity, in the company of the few people who truly understood him, and in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He had left behind a world of appearances and superficialities, and in its place, he had built a legacy that would live on long after his death. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this incredible story. If it moved you as much as it did us, don't leave without subscribing. We want you to keep enjoying more stories filled with unexpected twists and deep emotions. Tell us in the comments, what surprised you the most? How do you think you would react if you were in Richard's shoes? We'd love to read your opinion and debate with you. And before you go, don't forget to check out the next story that's about to appear on your screen. It will surely leave you thinking just as much as this one did. We promise intense moments, surprises, and emotions you won't want to miss. See you in the next video.